1889 was an important year. It marked 100 years since the French Revolution had originally occurred, and with that came the centennial celebrations. It served as a time to reflect upon the treacherous battle between Republicanism and Monarchism that had taken place over the past century. Even within the Third Republic, there had been a constant struggle between Republicans and Monarchists for control of the Republican government. The Republic had just gone through its greatest crisis yet, with the Monarchists led by General Georges Boulanger nearly being destined for victory. The Republicans now stood as the undisputed rulers of France. Republican rule would not be in question, but what form that Republican rule would take would be. The 1893 French legislative election took place on the 20th of August and 3rd of September 1893 to elect 574 deputies to the French National Assembly. The Republicans had managed to hang on to power in an election they fought tooth and nail. The economic downturn that plagued France throughout the 1880s had nearly allowed the monarchists back to power, but by the turn of a new decade the economy was starting to recover. Pierre Tirard stepped down from the prime ministership in March 1890, and he would be replaced by Charles de Freycinet, who would form his final ever cabinet. His government would last nearly 2 years into February 1892, when he would be replaced by Senator and former Public Works Minister Émile Loubet, who would last in office until November. These two governments are notable for they represented the beginning of a change in governing philosophy on behalf of Republicans. In the wake of the Boulanger crisis, these two governments prioritized ensuring domestic stability over further Republican reforms, as seen by their relatively stable rules. During his time in office, Freycinet would work to unify the diverse Republican coalition behind the defense of democracy and the institutions of a republic. He would suppress several strikes carried out by labor groups during his tenure, something that got him scorned by the socialists on the leftmost side of the House of Deputies. As Prime Minister, Freycinet also held the war portfolio, and he would use his dual position to reform the army. He would create 3-year terms of service, a general staff, as well as the Supreme War Council. On trade, Freycinet would pursue a protectionist policy in an attempt to deal with the economic downturn, as seen in an 1892 law that increased tariffs on agricultural imports. On the diplomacy front, Freycinet would sign an alliance with the Russian Empire, as well as a friendship treaty with the United Kingdom, in which both countries would recognize their colonial claims, paving the way for a future Anglo-French alliance. Even after leaving office, Freycinet would not end his involvement in politics, and he would not leave Parliament until after 1920, when he retired from political life until his death just 3 years later on May 14, 1923. Émile Loubet likewise focused on the defense of the Republic's institutions. His cabinet would be faced by a flurry of assassination attempts from rising anarchist terror groups who attempted to take out their rage on the governing regime. Loubet would suppress them along with several strikes just like his predecessor, but most famous being the Carmel mine strike, where Loubet would send in troops to quell demonstrations. Loubet's government would only last until November 1892, as it would be brought down by the Panama Scandal. Oh boy, we're gonna have to go over this, don't we? Okay. In 1879, Ferdinand Lesseps, a French entrepreneur who had financed the building of the Suez Canal, conceived a second project: the construction of a canal in Panama linking the Caribbean Sea to the Pacific Ocean. Building commenced in 1882, and it was thought that the canal could have been built in the same way as the Suez, which opened 10 years prior, but difficulties arose that were not present with the Suez. The biggest of these was the difference in water elevation on both sides of Panama, which meant that digging a flat piece of land through the country would not be sufficient. There were also issues with the epidemic of yellow fever and malaria that befell the diggers that were assigned to the project. In 1884, with less than a tenth of the canal done, Lesseps' company would run out of money, which stalemated the project. If he wanted the canal built, he would have to look elsewhere for funding. He would first make contact with Cornelius Herz, a Franco-American businessman with links both to Charles de Freycinet and the Gravy family. Lesseps would additionally finance The Justice, a newspaper that belonged to Georges Clemenceau. It would take many years, but eventually in 1888 the French Parliament agreed to give Lesseps a 720 million franc lottery loan for the building of a canal. Even though the company had successfully gotten this loan, things would not last, as the company's failings would cause it to go bankrupt within a single year, at the expense of its 80,000 investors. The scandal would break in September 1892 when Edouard Dremont, an infamous anti-Semitic journalist, would expose the scandal in his newspaper after having received classified documents from Baron Jacques de Reynac, one of the earliest investors in Lesseps' company. Day by day, Dremont would reveal the names of different politicians, businessmen, and bankers that had been involved in granting Lesseps the loan. The scandal would explode in intrigue when Reynac's dead body was found on the 20th of November. A committee would be formed to investigate the government's involvement in the scandal, but it could not begin investigating before Prime Minister Loubet and other members of the cabinet resigned from the weight of the scandal. What made the scandal stick in the public consciousness was Dremel's successful attempts to use the situation to hammer in his anti-Semitic message. Reynac, along with several other of Lesseps' other big financiers, were Jewish, and he used that to spread his message that Jewish people secretly ran the country and were thus responsible for the corruption that plagued the Republic. Alexandre Ribot would take over as Prime Minister in December 1892, and he would have to deal with the aftermath of the scandal. His government would start off badly, as within just 5 days, the finance minister, former Prime Minister Maurice Rouvier, would resign after the committee had found him guilty of corruption. In the end, more than 100 members of parliament would be charged with corruption charges, including multiple ministers within the Ribot government as well as Georges Clemenceau, who still led the radicals in parliament. Despite all the charges, no one would go to jail, with the exception of Charles Bayot, the former Minister of Public Works, who would be given a 5-year prison sentence. Clemenceau's involvement in the affair would be the final straw for the radicals, and the moderate Republicans would attempt to separate themselves from the radicals, starting to look rightward in the House of Deputies for support. Charles Dupuy would take over as Prime Minister in April 1893, and he would start moving the moderate Republicans towards conservatism. The progressives, as they called themselves, would start looking for support among the Catholic right as they distanced themselves from the radicals. Despite what their name might suggest, the progressives were actually the most conservative faction of Republicans, being successors to the center-left faction that had once been led by Jules Dufour. The progressives desired stability, both for the Republic and for the nation, and feared that if they moved too far towards reforms, they would create a reaction that would cause another Boulanger-like figure to arise. To achieve this desired stability, the progressives would begin upholding a conservative status quo of institutions both Republican and religious. To do this, they would ally with pro-Republic Catholics, which would require the progressives to drop the anti-clericalism that the Republicans had implemented over the previous decade. This rapprochement was made easier in 1892 when Pope Leo XIII published an encyclical asking French Catholics to rally behind the Republic and work within its institutions to further the interests of the faith. 1893, however, was an election year, and to implement their vision, the progressives would have to achieve victory. This election was something in French history that hadn't been seen since the Revolution, as it wasn't fought primarily between monarchists and Republicans, but rather between two different and opposing factions of Republicans. This election would be fought over what the Republic stood for. The progressives led by Dupuy would argue that the Republic was democracy and the institutions that sustained it, and that only they could help ensure the Republic's stability. The radicals led by Clemenceau, on the other hand, would argue in favor of a republic of values, one that was built on principles such as liberty, equality, and secularism that the progressives were moving to erase. The monarchists ran in this election too, but they would be weakened from a movement of some conservative Catholics towards the Republic, as well as the internal struggle in the coalition between the traditional monarchists and nationalists more aligned with the politics of Boulanger. The Workers' Party was hopeful going into this election, as they were able to exploit the radicals' precarious position following Clemenceau's scandal, which allowed them to portray themselves as the true bringers of revolutionary change in French society, as opposed to Clemenceau's bunch, who were just as corrupt as anyone else. Now let's see the results. Well, this was a close one, probably the closest election so far, although maybe not in the way you'd think. The progressives came out on top, as they won 272 seats with 48.6% of the vote, while the radicals had only won 166 seats with 26.6% of the vote, not coming particularly close to gaining the top spot. Even more disastrously than this, in the Var department, Georges Clemenceau had lost his own seat to Joseph Jourdan, an independent that had received backing both from the Workers' Party and the Progressives, although he would join the radicals upon assuming his seat. The monarchists had a bad time. They fell down to 77 seats, with not even attaining 20% of the vote. Largely due to many conservative Catholic voters they relied on moving to support either the progressives or a new group of Republican conservatives, often called the Ralliers. The Workers' Party for its part made use well of the after effects of the Panama scandal, as they elevated their seat count to 41, with leader Jules Guesde successfully winning the seat he ran for in Lille this time. The progressives had managed to win through broadening their base of support while successfully marketing themselves as the most effective defenders of the Republic, but they still had come short of the outright majority of the seats in the House of Deputies. This is what made the results contentious, as opposed to the top spot itself being closely fought. This would become a problem in November 1893 when the Dupuy government collapsed after radical ministers resigned en masse and left the government without majority support. President Sadi Carnot would task Eugene Spuller with forming a new majority government, but his negotiations would fail, which sent things back to the drawing board. Carnot would select a new candidate, this time being Jean-Casimir Perier, the president of the House of Deputies. Looking rightward, Casimir Perier would form an alliance with the Ralliers, who had won 35 seats in the election, through promises of rolling back the anti-clerical measures of previous Republican governments and ensuring religious toleration. Together, the seat counts of the Progressives and Ralliers constituted a majority, which would allow Casimir Perier to win the confidence of the House and become Prime Minister. Through clever dealings and good luck, the Progressives had managed to stay in power, and without support from the Radicals, something that hadn't happened since the election of 1881. The Radicals, on the other hand, were in the worst position they had ever been in, as they had lost their own leader, the man which had driven them for more than a decade. The Monarchists and the Workers' Party, for their part, both served as buffers on the extremes of Parliament, too small to be expected to influence the composition of a governing coalition, at least at first glance. I thank you all for watching. Make sure to subscribe if you want to see more, and tune in next time for the election of 1898.